Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our third edition of Stories for the Season. We are very excited to once again be partnering with NUCAT and State Street Theater to give you these readings of the season. This year, our theme, if you couldn't tell, is snow and snowstorms. We've got some wonderful fiction readings as well as true readings about storms that happened right here in New Ulm, firsthand accounts and newspaper clippings that we'd like to thank the Brown County Historical Society and their archives for letting us use those, and we hope you enjoy this year's Stories for the Season.
Well, happy day. We're going to be talking about blizzards this morning, and it's at this taping, it's very nice outside. I happen to be Mary Ellen Domeyer. I'm with the State Street Theater Company, and we're happy to do this collaboration with the New Ulm Public Library and New Ulm Cable Access Television. The very first reading I have here today about a blizzard is one provided by Richard Pfefferly. I love saying that name, Pfefferly. And this goes back to a blizzard in 1866. It's a very vivid account. When Dr. Falwell was preparing the third volume of his comprehensive history of Minnesota, he wrote to Richard Pfefferly, a remarkably well-informed pioneer resident of Fort Ridgely and also of New Ulm, asking him to jot down his recollections of the famous blizzards of 1866 and 1873. Pfefferly, although an old man at the time, possessed a wonderfully retentive memory for names and dates, as well as facts, and it is to be regretted that more reminiscences of the character of the following, which he dictated to Fred Johnson in response to Falwell's request, could not have been drawn from the storehouse of his early day experiences. During the fall and winter of 1865-1866, and for a year prior thereto, Harry Simmons and I had charge of B.H. Randall's Sutler store at Fort Ridgely. This store, which also served as the garrison and frontier post office, was located about 300 feet southwest of the square forming the fort proper. Between it and the fort were the guardhouse and the magazine, the stables being a few hundred feet further away and more nearly south of the square. From the time the fort was established, it had been the custom to post guards at all of these places, and this custom was in vogue at the time of which I write. The guards were to be relieved every 2 hours. It was also the custom for officers from the fort to drop in at the store almost every evening and while away their time at card playing or the entertainment of civilians from the surrounding area. The evening of February 14th, the day of the storm's inception, was no exception to the rule. Besides Mr. Simmons and myself, there were present at the store on that particular evening Lieutenant Cronkite and another gentleman from the fort, Miles P. Clark, and a Mr. Thompson, who had come down from Redwood Falls during the afternoon to get the mail intended for the agency. The day had been an unusually mild and pleasant one, and there was absolutely no indication of what was in store for us. At about 9 o'clock, as I recollect it now, without the slightest warning, the storm struck. So violent was the onslaught of the wind that the building, though a new one, shook as though it would go to pieces at any moment. Our visitors started immediately in the direction of the fort, but as I subsequently learned, floundered around like blindfolded men for fully half an hour before getting their bearings. Luckily, the four had kept together. Had they separated, some or all of them would undoubtedly have perished in the storm. As it was, they got no further than the guardhouse, stumbling against the rear of this building by the nearest accident and groping their way along the wall until they reached the entrance on the other side. There they found the guards who had sought the building for shelter, and there too they were compelled to remain the balance of the night. Lieutenant Cronkite is said to have offered $5 to any soldier who would conduct him into the fort, but none could be induced to volunteer the risk, notwithstanding the entrance to the square was less than 100 feet away. When daylight broke, they managed to reach headquarters, but then only with the greatest difficulty. Those who found themselves caught at the stables had a still more trying experience. They did not dare leave the building for fear of being lost, and a fire of any kind to mitigate the intense cold was, of course, out of the question. All the night long, they had to keep walking back and forth between the stalls to keep from freezing. Captain Kellogg of Company B, 10th U.S. Regulars, was in command of the fort. To supply the milk for his family, he kept a cow in the small stable outside the square northeast of the quarters. On the morning of the first day of the blizzard, one of his men ventured forth to milk this cow. Hardly had he started when the wind carried off his cap, and in trying to recover it, he lost his bearings and struggled blindly in the drift of snow till late in the afternoon. To assist him in getting back to the fort, it was suggested that one of the cannons be fired, but as these could not be reached with safety, it was decided to load an old musket with a heavy charge of powder, fasten it to a post outside the building, and fire it by means of a long string attached to the trigger. The ruse worked successfully. The man heard the report, got his bearings, and soon appeared at the northeast corner of the square, entered a building, and dropped at the threshold from sheer exhaustion. At the store, it seemed that to Mr. Simmons and myself that the storm would never end. The building shook incessantly. The wind drove the fine snow through the newly shingled roof, and we and all we could do to keep warm, although we kept a fire burning continuously in an old box stove. I cannot recall ever having experienced such bitter cold. Whenever it became necessary to replenish our supply of fuel, Mr. Simmons would tie the sleeves and collar of my overcoat securely, and I would venture out, feeling my way along the wall of the building to the woodpile in the rear. If I had lost contact with the wall at any time, there is no telling if I would ever have returned. So blinding was the snow that feeling was out of the question. Seeing was out of the question. For food, we had to be satisfied with cove oysters, crackers, canned peaches, and tea, the tea being prepared in an empty tin can for want of other utensils. In this way, we managed until the afternoon of the third day, when the storm abated and the weather turned suddenly mild. Then it was that we realized what we had gone through. Trees 60 feet high were completely buried from sight, and the deep ravines surrounding the fort were filled to the level with snow so hardly packed that teams could be driven in any direction. The deeper the snow, the harder and better the road. When I think back to it now, how fortunate it seems that the blizzard struck at nighttime, when almost everybody was safely at home and the stock in a sheltered place, instead of during the day. Great suffering there was, to be sure, and some loss of life, but it was as nothing compared with what it would have been had the storm started a few hours earlier, or had the country been settled up as it is today. Then there were not more than 100 settlers living over a stretch of 180 miles northeast of Fort Ridgely. Major Brown had established a mail route known as the Pony Express between Fort Ridgely and Fort Wadsworth in the spring of 1865, and I was over this route in the spring of 1866 on my way to Montana. I can recall only a small settlement at Beaver Creek, another at Redwood Falls, and one made up of a few families from Philadelphia at the mouth of the Chippewa River near the present site of Montevideo. At Artichoke Lake near Big Stone, we ran across a lone settler by the name of Taylor, who said he had not seen a human face for 8 months. So tickled was he to meet us that he immediately decided to pull up stakes and join us on our trip to Montana. Company A, 2nd Cavalry, stationed at Fort Wadsworth during the winter of the storm, had received orders early in February to report at Fort Snelling to be mustered out of the service. February 14th being such a beautiful day, they chose it for the start of their trip overland by way of Fort Abercrombie, which was about 100 miles northeast of Wadsworth. Late in the afternoon, they observed a storm approaching from the west, and Captain Fields, with 4 of his men, went ahead in search of a suitable place for a camp for the night. That was the last seen of them alive. Captain Fields' body was not found until the following June, although his father had gone to considerable expense and trouble in searching for it. The bodies of the men who were with him were found earlier. When the storm overtook the company, they had succeeded in reaching a small hollow, by no means an ideal place for a camp, but far better than the open prairies during a blizzard. Here they were forced to stay until the afternoon of the 3rd day. Food they had for both men and horses, but could not make use of it. Bitter cold added to the pangs of hunger, and the men suffered terribly. That no lives were lost was due perhaps to the fact that one man had more presence of mind than the rest. He used a mule whip to keep the men stirring and allowed no one to fall into a stupor. One woman with the company, the wife of Sergeant Frank Ide, she was the daughter of Mr. Limson, who killed Little Crow on July 14, 1863. 2 members of Company A, on a furlong, which they intended to spend with their families at Blue Earth City, left Fort Wadsworth the day previous to the departure of the company. They went with the Pony Express, driven by a Mr. Shaw, and had gotten as far as the vicinity of Lac qui Parle when the storm overtook them. The 2 passengers became separated from the driver, and after a time found themselves on a wind-swept strip of ice, which proved to be the Minnesota River. This they followed until they came to a camp of friendly Indians, where they learned that their arms and legs were frozen stiff. The Indians cared for them as best they could, and on the 7th day after the storm brought them to Fort Ridgely, one of the men died a day or 2 after his arrival, but the other, Ben Franklin by name, underwent an operation at the hands of the post surgeon, Dr. Alfred Miller. All of his arms and legs were amputated, and it was doubtful for a long time if he could survive. He did, however, and the following summer, Captain P.B. Davy took him to Europe and exhibited him as a curiosity. Still later, he attended several of the Grand Army encampments in this country, and the press allotted considerable space to him as the only Civil War veteran who had lost all his limbs in the service of his country. In the larger frontier towns like New Ulm, the storm, of course, raged with equal fury, but naturally did not provide the hardships it did on the prairies. At Turner Hall in New Ulm, an entertainment was in progress. When the storm broke, few in their efforts to reach home got as far as the Naegeli residence, a block away, but most of the crowd had to spend the entire night at the hall. At St. Peter, Governor Swift and his wife were giving a party for the society leaders of the town, and the experience of the guests here was such that some, as said, excuse me, the guest here was much the same as that, quote, enjoyed, quote, by the ones at Turner Hall. That ends the account of Mr. Richard Pfefferly of the blizzard of 1866.